I wanted to recreate If It's Not Living, It's Not With You. So I sat down and in a couple of hours, I made this. And I want to show you how I made it. I want to talk about the guitar tones. 1975 has two guitar players. First one is Matty himself, and then the lead guitarist, Adam. There's a whole lot of info here, with these two pedal board photos being the most important, I feel like. But if we had to break it down into very simple aspects, anything that's sort of tubey or slappy, I would say is a Strat, and it's probably something that Matty is playing. Just kind of sing along to the song and think, is it really hard to play this lead line while I'm singing? If so, then it's probably something that Adam is playing. And for what Adam is playing, we're going to be using a Jazz Master with a broken string that is part of the sound. It's a bit brighter than a humbucker, but it has a little bit more bite than regular single coils that you would get in a Strat. In terms of an amp, we're going to be using either a Roland Jazz Chorus. You could also maybe use like a high watt for a lot of the high gain stuff, or a Fender style amp. So this is Matty's and this is Adam's. So something I think that is important to hit, there's always a compressor pedal at the very front, which makes sense. These are very pop guitar parts, and so you want to make sure that your signal going into your pedal board is going to be as consistent as possible. And then some kind of chorus here at the end, at least for Matty's stuff. And then Adam looks like he has a lot of different fuzzes and overdrive options. So that's sort of the general framework I was using to build these tones from scratch. So for the main lead here, we're starting out with a really aggressive compressor, and then we're going into a high watt style amp, into Boss style distortion pedal. That's not on the pedal board right now, but I know for a fact Adam really liked using Boss overdrive pedals in the first record. It almost has that like square wave fuzz face feel, but still has enough of the brightness and distortion. Then we're running into some EQ for shaping, an 1176 to level it out, into a little bit of a Memory Man, a little bit of shaping with Pro Q3. One of the biggest contributors to the tone of this track is the gated reverb. Like, let me show you. Here's the lead without gated reverb, and here's with gated reverb. I have two gated reverbs going, actually. One of them is a little bit more subdued, and that's where I would say a majority of like the band elements are going to. But then I have another one here that's a little bit more aggressive in terms of how in your face it is, and that's mainly for the snare, just because I felt like the snare drum had so much character to it and this like feel that I thought it was really important to have that on its own separate reverb. So I just made it its own reverb. Underneath that, we have this guy, a lead that I think Matty would be playing. I used the Strat for that guy. Again, going into a compressor, into Roland Jazz Chorus with the same kind of like EQ and 1176 after that. Really a large part of this is using sort of a ROM reverb, which I took inspiration from because he has a big sky here, and I kind of felt like there was that vibe in it. Underneath that, we have this guy, which is sort of like the main 2B lead, playing really simple two-note stuff just to sort of get that like backbeat rhythm. Again, using some chorus after the chain, similar to the pedal board. And then we have this guy who just kind of comes in as like a call and response thing. These guys have so much attitude just on their own. So like if I solo all of the guitars, they sound like this. Like, so much of the rhythmic vibe of the track is in these electric parts and how they're playing these subdivision rhythms, and then they all kind of line up for specific hits. It's a really great exploration of how to arrange electric parts. Underneath that, we have our bass. So I tried doing this sort of similar rig rundown thing for the bass tone, and not surprisingly, people seem to care a lot less about the bass than they do the guitars. There's not a whole lot of info on it. I was able to use this like Equip Board article. So the main things I wanted to hit was A, vintage P bass, the fact that it's going through an amp and not just a straight DI, which was very normal for disco stuff. And this guy, very interesting. There's a subharmonic synthesizer rack, which makes sense because when you listen to a lot of the 1975 stuff, you do hear this sort of like sub layer in the bass that just kind of cuts through everything. And the fact that there's compression at the beginning of the chain and at the end of the chain. So this is how I recreated it. So here's what the clean DI sounds like. Again, that's using my P bass. And when I say a P bass, I don't just mean like Fender style bass, like legitimately a P bass has such a unique sort of lower mid-range compared to something like a jazz bass that I really think that most people should have at least one in their studio if you're doing this kind of style of music. So first thing we do is go into a compressor, going into Bass Invader. And since they were using a distressor for the rack mount here, I thought it might be fun to try using something that was a compressor but also had a little bit of a grit to it. So I'm trying Supercharger GT. And then a lot of tone is being added by this. This is the unfiltered audio basement. Some light tweaks made to this bass smoother preset. Here's the bass with all the guitars. Underneath that bass, there's actually like a subtle synth layer. It sounds like this. If you want to hear it a little bit more cleanly, go to the bridge. That sort of bump, 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 bump. That synth is actually also kind of doubling the bass, like the live P bass when it's playing. So we just have a basic Juno patch here. Running that into Decapitator by Sound Toys, which honestly I've slept on for so long and I'm kind of annoyed that it took me so long to actually download it because it is stupid practical. Basically, you have a bunch of different channel strip types here at the bottom that you can pick from, and you can get a sort of analog channel strip style distortion just in this plugin. Here's without it. And here's with. Bandpassing it a bit, getting that sort of nasaliness. And so when you layer it underneath the live bass, the two of them sound like this. And in the context of the rest of the mix, it just kind of fills it up a lot. And if you don't pay attention to it, you actually don't notice that it's there. Now we're gonna go look at the synths. Probably the most famous synth from this song are the ZXs. Again, without the reverb, kind of sound dinky. Reverb's on. Using a mixture of two different synths for this guy. First, we're using Arturia's DX7. Sounds like this. And I'm layering that with Anna 2. I just felt like this one had a little bit more of like the brighter high-end side of it. Mix them both together. Bada bing, bada boom. We have a bunch of pads, 3 main ones. So again, all these guys are running into a really heavy Decapitator patch. With the 1975, it's not super clean. There's a lot of like analog fuzziness. And so with these softer elements, it's kind of good to like muddy them up a bit. First one we have is a Juno. Playing a basic root in a fifth, and then we're bandpassing it just to get that specific range we want from it. Below that, we have this sort of vocal pad thing happening in Arcade. Bandpassing it, and then post bandpass, we're driving it a bit with Decapitator. And then we also have this very high Juno. Bandpassing and running through some ROM reverb. Gets this sort of ambient cloudiness. Underneath those synths, we have a couple of hyper textured pieces playing inside of Particle. In the 1975, there's a lot of like really fun sound design stuff happening, especially with this record where George, the producer, was getting more into Eurorack stuff and modular stuff and sound design. And so there's just not really an easy way to replicate stuff like that. So I think your best bet is just either making your own samples in that sort of sound design style, or just using something like this to get something approximate to it. Again, using some ROM and some Pro Q just to shape it a little bit. For a lot of the intro part, I felt like there was almost this like vocal shot happening in between certain hits. So I got some distant voices, really soft vocal. We decapitate them, we shape it a little bit, and then it sounds like this. Underneath that, we have our drums for the kick, which is this guy, Bedroom Beats Lo-Fi Hip Hop pack on Splice. Our hi-hat is this guy from the Analog Synthwave pack. The most time I spent was on the snare, which I was really happy with. The main one was this guy from the Synthwave expansion pack, without the gated reverb, with the gated reverb. So it's like, you need to get the gated reverb on that. And then I wanted to add a little weird buzz to it because I felt like there's this subtle brightness added to it. So what I did was I created this audio effects rack. And this is a really simple trick to turn any effect or processing chain that you have in Ableton into sort of a blend effect with like a wet and a dry. So here's what you do. You get an audio effects rack. You hit this button here that lets you make multiple chains. You drop a utility here and you leave it alone. If you want to, you can rename that dry. And then whatever effect you want to use, you can just sort of drop in here underneath that. And then you can just kind of blend it underneath. That sounds disgusting, and that's not the chain that I made, but that's how you can use it. The way that I ended up using it here was Waves Factory has this free plugin called Snare Buzz. It's a way to add a bottom mic to any sample that you have. So all the way wet sounds like this. So the regular sample that's coming through the audio is triggering this to play a sample of snare wires. And then I ran it into some erosion frequency. And so when you blend all of that together, you get this sort of little white noise layer underneath the snare, which when you take out, it just makes it a little bit less exciting. Another way to sort of oomph that up a bit was I grabbed this white noise sample, and it's just hitting on every snare hit. And I have a gate here that is set to sidechain from that first snare. So instead of a sidechain compressor where you're using the hit to bring something down, you're using a sidechain gate to open up that source. So now it sounds like this. Used a little bit of Pro Q to make it cleaner, a little bit of wider from Infected Mushroom. And so those two elements blended together sound like this, which I personally think sounds better than just. After that, all the drums are running through Decapitator. And then I wanted to use a little bit of compression, so I have this parallel squasher preset, basically just to make the snare hit a little bit harder. We have some clap impacts. And those are all of the elements on my master bus, using a little bit of compression, the lightest amount of decapitator, using the low cut and high cut to sort of narrow in on like a mid-range frequency, a little bit of RC20, like 1%, to make sure the warble's kind of tame. So with all of that, let me show you what the final results sounds like, and you can tell me how close you think I got to it. So I think I got pretty close. What do you guys think? Put down in the comments below, or talk about things that you would do differently. You know, I am the supreme authority for everything, but I like to get some insight occasionally. But yeah, I'm really excited to do more videos this year in this new format. And yeah, I'll be seeing you guys every other week because I want to put more effort into these videos. But yeah, talk to you guys later.